I heard my father before I saw him. It was the same voice that used to call me in for dinner when I was a girl, firm, certain, the kind of voice that expected the world to line up neatly behind it. Only now it carried through a packed hall of uniforms and families, floating above the low murmurs like a claim. "She dropped out of the Navy," he said to someone nearby. Not whispered, not said with regret, said like it was a fact he'd stamped and filed away years ago. Couldn't handle it. But my boy now, he's a different story. For a moment my body reacted the way it always had. A tightening in the chest. A small familiar ache behind the ribs. Not anger, anger burns too hot and too quickly. This felt older than that. This felt like weather you've lived through so many times you stop checking the forecast. I stood at the back of the hall with my hands folded, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. Civilian clothes. No uniform, no insignia, no medals. If anyone glanced my way, they'd see a woman in her late middle age who looked like she belonged in any American crowd, maybe a teacher, maybe a nurse, maybe someone's aunt who brought casseroles to church potlucks and listened more than she talked. That was the point. I had spent much of my adult life learning how to be invisible when visibility served no purpose. I had learned how to sit still when people expected a reaction, how to keep my face calm when words tried to provoke an answer out of me. Silence had become a kind of armor, quiet, disciplined, dependable. On the stage, flags stood at attention, their fabric hardly moving in the conditioned air. The seats were nearly full. Families held printed programs in their laps like hymnals. The room had that particular smell of polished floors and pressed fabric, a mix of duty and anticipation. A ceremony like this doesn't feel like entertainment. It feels like something sacred to the people who understand what it costs. My brother was going to receive recognition that day, earned unquestionably. I was there for him. I was there because I'd promised myself long ago that I wouldn't let bitterness decide what kind of sister I became. The band quieted. A voice called the room to order. People straightened in their chairs. There was a hush that settled over the crowd, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. And then, just before the ceremony truly began, the general stepped into view. He moved with the unhurried steadiness of someone who didn't need to prove he belonged in his own skin. His uniform was impeccable, but it wasn't the fabric that commanded attention. It was the calm weight he carried, the invisible authority that comes from years of decisions that mattered. He scanned the room the way leaders do, not out of curiosity but out of habit. Front row, second row, parents and dignitaries. Smiles, nerves, pride held carefully in check. His gaze moved like a slow spotlight, and then it reached the back. Reached me. Our eyes met. There was no confusion in his expression, no searching look, just recognition. The kind that lands quietly like a hand on the shoulder as if to say, "I see you." He paused just a fraction. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but I noticed everything. I always had. Then, in a tone so calm it almost blended into the silence, he said words I hadn't expected to hear spoken aloud in any room filled with my father's assumptions. "Rear Admiral, you're here." For a heartbeat the hall seemed to stop moving. The air itself felt heavier. Not because the words were loud, they weren't, but because they were undeniable. 200 SEALs rose to their feet in one clean motion. Not chaotic, not startled, disciplined, reflexive, like a single body responding to a command it didn't need to be given. Chairs scraped softly. Fabric shifted. Boots aligned. The sound wasn't a roar, it was a wave. A sudden, unified surge of respect that hit the room and left a kind of stunned quiet behind it. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't lift a hand to my chest the way people do in movies. I simply stood slowly because returning respect matters, and because I would not turn that moment into performance. Behind me, I felt my father go still. When I turned my head slightly, I saw him frozen in place, his face drained of color. It wasn't the look of a man who'd been outsmarted. It was the look of a man whose story had just collapsed in front of witnesses. My mother sat beside him, eyes wide, hand half raised to her mouth as if she'd caught herself mid-breath. Her expression wasn't anger. It was shock, layered with something else, recognition maybe. The realization that she had lived for years with a gap she never tried to fill. And my brother stood on the floor with the other candidates, face composed as trained, but his eyes searching. He looked out into the crowd the way a man does when something in his world shifts unexpectedly. When his gaze landed on the back row, he frowned as if he couldn't reconcile what he was seeing with what he had been told. I knew what he was thinking. I didn't blame him. He was raised under the same roof, hearing the same stories. The difference was that he'd never needed to question them. He'd been the hero in my father's version of the world. I was the quiet footnote. For years, my father had been a respected man in our community. He went to church every Sunday, sat in the same pew, shook the pastor's hand, and made sure people knew his family valued service. He wasn't cruel. That's what made it harder. He was simply certain in a way that left no room for nuance, no room for unanswered questions. When I was young, I was the child who did what she was told and didn't ask for attention. If there was a choice between speaking and listening, I listened. My brother filled rooms without trying. Teachers praised him. Coaches slapped his back. My father saw himself in him, bold, visible, undeniable. I joined the Navy for reasons I never fully explained to my family, not because they wouldn't have understood, but because they didn't make space to ask. I didn't join to chase glory. I joined because I wanted structure, purpose, and a life built on responsibility rather than approval. My path didn't look like my brother's, and it didn't lend itself to proud storytelling over coffee after church. Over time, my silence became an inconvenience to my father. He didn't like not knowing, and instead of admitting that, he filled the blanks with something simpler, something he could repeat without fear of being corrected. She dropped out. It was easier for him to say that than to say, "I don't know what my daughter does." Easier than admitting that a quiet life can still be powerful. Easier than acknowledging that some service is invisible by necessity, not by failure. The general held my gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, and returned to the ceremony as if nothing unusual had happened. He didn't explain. He didn't elaborate. That was his own form of respect. In my world, you don't turn someone's life into a speech without permission. And just like that, the ceremony continued, flags, cadence, formal words, while something deeper rippled under the surface of every face in the room. I had come to sit quietly and watch my brother be honored. I hadn't come to be seen. But sometimes the truth doesn't ask what you came for. Sometimes it simply arrives steady, calm, undeniable, and stands on its own. The hall kept moving after the general spoke, but inside me time rewound. That's what moments like that do. They don't just change a room, they reach back and touch every year that led to it. As the seals sat down again and the ceremony continued, I stayed standing for a beat longer than necessary, not out of drama, but because my legs suddenly felt the weight of everything I'd carried quietly. Then I eased back into my seat in the last rows, hands folded again, face composed, as if my heart hadn't just been reminded how long I'd lived inside other people's assumptions. My father didn't look back. He didn't need to. The truth had found him without my help. People imagine that if you've worn a uniform long enough, you stop feeling things. That's not true. You just learn what to do with the feelings. You set them aside until the job is done. You breathe through them. You keep your posture steady. And then later, when you're alone, when the noise fades, you let yourself remember. I joined the Navy right out of college in a season of my life when everyone around me seemed to be choosing comfort. Getting married young, finding safe jobs near home, settling into routines they could explain over Sunday lunch. I wasn't looking for danger. I was looking for purpose. I wanted a life where hard work meant something real, where discipline wasn't a personality trait but a standard. My father didn't like the idea at first. He liked tradition, yes, but only when it fit his expectations. He was proud of service when it came with stories he could tell. My brother had already been talking about SEALs like they were carved out of legend, and my father loved that. It was clean and dramatic and easy to understand. I was different. I filled out forms quietly. I made my decisions without a lot of fanfare. The day I left for training, my father hugged me and said, "Don't make a fool of yourself like it was half a joke." My mother cried softly into a dish towel in the kitchen. My brother teased me for being the serious one, then hugged me longer than he meant to. At officer candidate school, the Navy introduced me to a truth that would shape my entire life. There are many kinds of strength, and not all of them can be measured by who shouts the loudest. Some people thrive on the visible tests, mile runs, obstacle courses, the kind of hardship you can point to and say, "See, I did that. I respected those people. I admired them." But I also noticed something else: the Navy didn't run on bravado. It ran on planning, on coordination, on discipline that didn't require an audience. I gravitated toward the work that made the visible triumphs possible. I studied logistics because I learned quickly that courage is useless without fuel, without timing, without supplies arriving where they're needed when they're needed. I leaned into intelligence and strategy because I saw what happens when decisions are made on pride instead of facts. I trained in environments where the most important sentence you could say was, "We don't know yet," followed by the harder work of finding out. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of thing my father would brag about at church. It was, however, the kind of work that kept people alive. My first assignments taught me how quickly life can turn on details. A shipment delayed, a plan misunderstood, a piece of information misread. In rooms with no windows and fluorescent lights that hummed like tired bees, I watched how leaders listened, how they asked questions, how they weighed consequences. And I learned something personal too: the more responsibility you carry, the less you talk about it. Phone calls home became complicated. At first I tried. I wanted my family to feel included, but I couldn't answer basic questions. Where are you? What are you doing? When will you be home? The truth was that I often didn't know the last one myself, and even when I did, I couldn't always say it out loud. So I started keeping things simple. "I'm fine," I'd tell my mother, "just busy." My father heard that as avoidance. He liked explanations. He liked neat narratives. Silence made him itchy like a tag in the back of a shirt. And the more I stayed quiet, the more he assumed I must have something to hide. When I missed Thanksgiving one year because of an unexpected tasking, my father's disappointment turned sharp. "Your brother would have found a way," he said. I didn't argue. My brother wasn't in my lane and I wasn't in his. Comparing us was like comparing a fireman to an air traffic controller. Both necessary, both different. Only one fit my father's idea of heroism. The missed milestones piled up quietly. A cousin's wedding I couldn't attend. A birthday dinner I apologized for. A Christmas where my mother set a place for me anyway, then cried when it stayed empty. Each time I swallowed the urge to over-explain and kept my words small because the truth was larger than I could share. My father eventually stopped asking. Instead, he started telling. I found out later in fragments the way you learn family legends you didn't consent to. A neighbor asked me once with careful sympathy if I was doing okay after leaving the Navy. An aunt patted my hand at a funeral and said, "You tried, sweetheart. That's what matters." Even my brother once during a rare phone call joked lightly, "Dad says you didn't like getting yelled at." I didn't correct him. Not because I didn't care, but because I understood how stories get passed down when no one stops them. And because part of my work, part of my discipline was learning when silence served something larger than my ego. Still, there were nights I lay awake in hotel rooms between flights listening to the soft roar of highways outside and wondered what it would have felt like to be known. Not praised, not paraded, just known. To have a father who asked questions instead of writing conclusions in ink. My career progressed the way a quiet river moves, steady, persistent, carving its way through stone without needing anyone to clap. Promotions came with more responsibility and fewer explanations. I accepted roles that required discretion, roles where the safest thing for everyone involved was for me to say less, not more. I didn't wear my life like a billboard, I wore it like a duty. And by the time my brother's name began appearing in conversations about elite training and SEAL selection, my own path had already moved into a realm my father wouldn't have known how to talk about, even if he'd wanted to. So when the invitation to that ceremony arrived and I chose to attend silently, it wasn't because I was afraid of being seen. It was because I'd spent a lifetime learning that the truest work doesn't beg for recognition. It simply shows up when it matters most. The morning of the ceremony arrived with the kind of quiet that only important days seem to carry. The sky was clear but muted, a pale blue stretched thin over the base, as if it too were holding its breath. I arrived early, not out of nerves but out of habit. Years of service had trained me to value empty rooms before they filled, to read spaces before voices changed their shape. The ceremony hall stood solid and unadorned, built more for function than beauty. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polish, and fabric-pressed uniforms cleaned floors order. Flags were already posted with exacting precision, their colors deep and still. Rows of chairs waited in quiet formation, aligned so carefully that even the gaps between them looked intentional. I chose a seat near the back, slightly off-center. From there, I could see everything without being seen myself. I wore a simple navy blazer, neutral slacks, sensible shoes. No jewelry beyond a watch I'd worn for years. No pins, no insignia. If anyone glanced my way, I would register as just another family member, someone's sister maybe, or a cousin who'd flown in and would fly out again. Families filtered in slowly, their voices hushed but excited. Mothers clutched programs as if they might dissolve without constant reassurance. Fathers stood straighter than usual, chests out, shoulders, squared, pride barely contained. There was laughter, but it was restrained, respectful. Everyone understood they were stepping into something earned. My parents arrived together. My father wore the same dark suit he reserved for church and funerals, freshly pressed tie straight. He moved through the room with ease, greeting people with firm handshakes and an air of belonging. This was his element, a public space where pride could be shared and validated. I watched him without resentment. Observation had long replaced judgment in me. "My son's a SEAL," he told one man, voice warm and confident. "Took everything they threw at him." The man nodded, impressed. My father smiled, basking in it. Then, as naturally as breathing, he added, "My daughter tried the Navy once. Dropped out. Different temperament." The man murmured something polite. The conversation drifted on. I felt the words land as they always did, with a dull familiarity. They no longer surprised me. What surprised me even now was how easily they were spoken, how comfortably my father wore a story built on assumptions. I didn't turn around. I didn't tense. I reminded myself of something I'd learned early: you can't correct a narrative in a room that isn't listening for the truth. And this room wasn't here for me. The ceremony began with the quiet authority of tradition. A command rang out. The room rose. The band played. The sound was crisp, measured, practiced. When everyone sat again, the stillness that followed felt earned. My brother stood with the other candidates at the front, posture, straight eyes forward. He looked exactly as he should, focused, composed, contained. Training had stripped away excess and left only what mattered. In that moment, he wasn't my brother or my father's pride. He was a sailor who had endured something most people never would. I felt nothing but respect for him. The general entered next, his presence shifting the room without a word. He moved with an ease that came only from long familiarity with command. Not hurried, not stiff, simply assured. His uniform was immaculate, but it wasn't the medals or the rank that quieted the space. It was the way he carried responsibility, as if it had settled into his bones. He took his place at the podium and began, his voice calm and deliberate. He spoke about commitment, about discipline, about the kind of perseverance that doesn't announce itself. His words weren't embellished. They didn't need to be. Everyone in the room understood what had been required to reach this moment. As he spoke, his gaze moved across the audience. Parents, families, dignitaries, faces tight with pride, nerves, gratitude. His eyes moved slowly, methodically, the way leaders read rooms without even realizing they're doing it. When his gaze reached the back, it paused. Just for a fraction of a second. Our eyes met. There was no surprise in his expression. No searching. Just recognition, quiet, certain. The kind that doesn't ask questions. The kind that comes from shared context, shared responsibility. He inclined his head almost imperceptibly. I returned the gesture in the same restrained way. The ceremony continued. Names were called, achievements acknowledged. The cadence of the event flowed smoothly, each part clicking into place like a well-rehearsed operation. I let myself be present, listening not just to the words, but to what they meant. This was the visible edge of a much larger system, one that relied as much on unseen decisions as on public acts of courage. I thought about the rooms I'd spent years in, windowless, secure, quiet. About maps spread across tables, plans revised at the last minute, conversations held in low voices, because lives depended on accuracy. I thought about how rarely anyone outside those rooms would ever know how close things had come to going wrong, or how deliberately they had been steered right. Halfway through the ceremony, my father leaned toward my mother and whispered something. She smiled, eyes never leaving the stage. Pride radiated from her in a softer way than his, less verbal, more constant. She had always been like that, present, supportive, cautious with conclusions. The general reached the closing portion of the ceremony. His tone shifted slightly, not louder, not heavier, just more deliberate. He paused, adjusted the microphone, and scanned the room once more. "This unit represents the best of what service can look like," he said. "But service doesn't always wear the same uniform, and it doesn't always stand at the front." A ripple of attention moved through the audience. He looked toward the back again. "Before we conclude," he said evenly, "I'd like to acknowledge a colleague in attendance." People glanced around, confused, curious. My father's head tilted slightly as if trying to anticipate where this was going. The general's eyes held mine. "Rear Admiral," he said, voice clear and respectful, "you're here." For a heartbeat, the room didn't react. And then, as if moved by a single unspoken command, 200 SEALs rose to their feet. Chairs shifted in unison. Fabric moved, boots aligned. The sound wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable, a disciplined response born of instinct and tradition. I remained seated for a brief moment, not out of defiance, but out of grounding. Then I stood, slowly returning respect without ceremony. I met the general's gaze and nodded once. He nodded back just as simply. Behind me, I felt the air change. When I turned my head slightly, I saw my father frozen in place, his face drained of color. The story he had told for years had nowhere left to stand. The general resumed the ceremony without further comment. No explanation, no elaboration. The truth had been spoken, that was enough. The sound of chairs settling back into place came slowly, unevenly, as if the room needed a moment to remember how to breathe again. Protocol resumed, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it. The ceremony moved forward, yet the air felt denser, charged with a realization no one had anticipated. I stood still for another second, feeling the weight of the moment settle fully into my body. Years of training had taught me that reactions matter less than restraint. I straightened my jacket, a small, unconscious gesture, and then eased back into my seat near the rear wall. From there I could see the stage clearly, and just as clearly the ripple the general's words had left behind. The men at the front stood straighter now, if that was even possible. They were professionals, they didn't whisper or look around. But awareness moved through them like a current. They understood hierarchy, they understood respect, and they understood exactly what had just been acknowledged. The general continued in a calm, even voice, as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. That, too, was intentional. Authority doesn't need to linger on itself. It states what is true and moves on. My brother remained forward-facing, disciplined eyes locked ahead, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the subtle shift that betrayed confusion. He had trained himself to hold focus under stress, yet this was not the kind of stress he had prepared for. This was personal. This was family. I didn't look at him for long. That moment wasn't about us yet. Behind me, my father still hadn't moved. When I finally turned my head slightly, I saw him sitting rigidly, hands pressed flat against his thighs. His mouth was slightly open, as if words had been forming there, and then abandoned him. His face, so often animated with certainty, was pale, stripped of its usual color and confidence. For the first time I could remember, my father looked unsure of what story he was standing in. I felt no satisfaction in that, no vindication. If anything, I felt a quiet heaviness. Truth, when it arrives without warning, doesn't always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like loss, the loss of an illusion you didn't realize you were relying on. The ceremony concluded with the same dignity it had begun. Final words were spoken, commands given, applause followed, measured, respectful, earned. The men on stage were congratulated, recognized, photographed. Families rose and pressed forward, smiles breaking through the restraint that had held them in check for the last hour. I remained seated until the first wave passed. Old habits again. You don't rush into noise when you don't need to. Eventually, I stood and stepped aside, allowing others to move around me. A few officers approached, not with curiosity but with acknowledgement. A nod. A brief handshake. "Ma'am." Nothing more. They didn't ask where I'd been or what I'd done. In our world, that kind of questioning would have been inappropriate. Recognition doesn't require explanation. The general passed by on his way down from the stage. He stopped briefly, just long enough to offer a quiet word. "I'm glad you could be here," he said. "So am I replied. That was all. We didn't need more. Across the room, my brother finally turned. His eyes found mine, and for a moment the distance between us, years of different paths, different understandings, felt suddenly visible. He excused himself from a group of fellow candidates and made his way toward me, stopping a few feet away. "Is it true?" he asked softly. There was no accusation in his voice, just honest confusion. "Yes," I said. He exhaled slowly, as if setting something heavy down. "I didn't know," he said. "I know," I replied. He nodded, absorbing that. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I considered him carefully. He wasn't asking as my father would have, defensively or with expectation. He was asking because his world had just shifted and he needed to understand where the ground was. "Because my work wasn't something I could explain," I said, and after a while it didn't feel necessary to try. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'm glad you're here." "So am I repeated. He hesitated, then stepped forward and hugged me, brief, firm, controlled. Not a dramatic gesture, but a sincere one. "You deserved to be seen," he said quietly. I felt my throat tighten just slightly. "This wasn't about that," I said. "Today is yours." He nodded, still. We parted without ceremony. I moved toward the exit before my father could gather himself enough to approach me. That conversation didn't belong in a room full of witnesses and cameras. Some reckonings require walls and quiet. Outside, the afternoon sun was warm but subdued, casting long shadows across the pavement. The parking lot buzzed with life families laughing, phones raised for photos, voices overlapping in relief and pride. Life moving forward, unchanged on the surface. I sat in my car for several minutes before starting the engine. My hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, steady despite the undercurrent of emotion still moving through me. I looked at my reflection in the windshield, older than the woman who first raised her hand and took the oath, marked by years of decisions made without applause. I thought about my father again, about the story he had told for years because it made his world simpler, and about how simplicity often comes at the cost of truth. I hadn't planned to be acknowledged that day. I hadn't come to correct anyone. I had come to witness my brother's achievement and leave quietly. But sometimes the truth doesn't wait for permission. Sometimes it steps forward, spoken by someone else at exactly the moment it needs to be heard. And once it's spoken, there is no unhearing it. The crowd thinned slowly, as if no one wanted to be the first to break the spell of what had just occurred. Conversations resumed in softer tones. Laughter sounded cautious, measured as though people were unsure how much of it belonged in a room that had witnessed something unscripted and deeply human. I moved deliberately, offering space to those who needed it. Years of service had taught me how to read rooms, not just for threats or logistics, but for emotion, who was ready to speak, who needed silence, who would remember this moment for the rest of their lives. A few men approached me quietly. Not in groups, one at a time. A nod, a handshake, a simple respectful "ma'am." Nothing else. They didn't ask questions. They didn't linger. They understood that recognition doesn't require conversation. In their restraint, I felt more seen than I ever had through applause. My brother found me again near the edge of the hall, where the noise faded into a manageable hum. Up close, I could see the exhaustion beneath his composure, the kind that settles into bone after years of relentless training. His eyes, however, were clear. "I didn't know," he said again, softer this time, as if the words needed to land gently. "I never expected you to," I replied. He frowned slightly. I should have asked. "Maybe," I said, "but we were both busy becoming who we needed to be." He nodded, accepting that without argument. "Dad's shaken," he added, glancing across the room. I followed his gaze. My father stood near a cluster of people he'd been speaking with earlier. Now he wasn't speaking at all. He stared down at the program in his hands, as if it might explain something to him if he looked long enough. The man who once filled rooms with certainty now seemed unsure where to place his weight. "I'll talk to him later," I said. My brother hesitated, then said, "I'm proud of you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. He wasn't proud of my rank or my recognition. He was proud because he had seen something about me that day he hadn't understood before: my restraint, my patience, my willingness to let truth stand on its own. "Thank you," I said. We hugged again briefly, then parted, each pulled in different directions by family and obligation. I stepped outside before the ceremony hall emptied completely. The fresh air felt grounding cool against my face. The sky had shifted toward afternoon sunlight, slanting across the parking lot in long golden lines. Families gathered near cars, children tugging at sleeves, cameras flashing. Pride lived here too, but now it felt quieter, more reflective. I leaned against my car for a moment, breathing slowly. I wasn't overwhelmed, but I was aware of something settling into place, an emotional ledger finally balancing itself. Not through confrontation, not through explanation, through acknowledgement. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from my mother. "Are you okay?" I typed back, "Yes, I'll call later." I didn't add more. She would understand. She always had, even when she didn't fully know how. That evening I checked into my hotel and ordered a simple dinner. I ate by the window, watching traffic move steadily along the road. The day replayed itself in fragments: the general's voice, the sound of chairs rising, my father's pale face, my brother's quiet hug. Each memory felt vivid but oddly calm, as if my mind were filing them carefully instead of reliving them. Later my phone rang. It was my father. I let it ring once more than usual before answering, not to punish him, just to give myself a breath. "I didn't know," he said as soon as I picked up. His voice was unsteady, stripped of its usual firmness. "I know," I replied. I told people things, he continued, things I shouldn't have. There was a pause, thick with words he wasn't yet ready to speak. "I never corrected you," I said gently, "but that doesn't mean it didn't matter." He exhaled long and slow. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked," I thought, but I didn't say it yet. "Because my work required silence," I said instead. "And because after a while I didn't think you wanted to hear a complicated answer." Another pause. Then quietly, I was wrong. The admission wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was real. And in that moment it mattered more than anything he could have said earlier in my life. "We'll talk," he added, "when you're ready." "Yes," I said, "we will." After the call ended, I sat on the edge of the bedphone, resting in my hand. I felt tired in a way that had nothing to do with the day's events, and everything to do with the release of something long held. Accountability, when it comes without cruelty, can feel like rest. That night sleep came easily. The next morning, as I prepared to leave town, I passed the ceremony hall once more. It stood quiet now, empty, waiting for the next moment that would fill it with meaning. I realized then that what had happened there wasn't the climax of my story. It was the hinge. The applause had faded. The recognition had passed. What remained was something more durable: the beginning of honesty, the possibility of reconciliation, and the understanding that truth doesn't always arrive with force. Sometimes it simply stands and waits to be acknowledged. We didn't talk again for several days. Not because either of us was avoiding the other, but because some conversations need distance before they can be honest. I had learned that in my work, decisions made too quickly without space to breathe often carried unseen consequences. This was no different. When my father finally asked if I could come by the house, he didn't frame it as a demand or an expectation. He asked carefully, almost formally, as if unsure what ground he was standing on. "Would you come over for dinner?" he said. "Just us. Your mother will be there, but I'd like to talk." "I can," I replied. The drive back felt longer than usual. Familiar roads stretched out in front of me, lined with trees I'd known since childhood. Nothing about the town had changed much. The grocery store still sat on the same corner. The church steeple still caught the afternoon light at the same angle. It struck me how places can remain constant while the people inside them quietly drift apart, then sometimes find their way back. My parents' house looked exactly as it always had. Neat lawn, porch light on even though the sun hadn't fully set yet. My father's habit again, better to see what's coming. When I stepped inside, the smell of cooking wrapped around me, warm and familiar. My mother greeted me with a gentle hug, lingering just a second longer than usual. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Her eyes told me she'd been carrying her own questions for years. My father stood near the kitchen table, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He looked older than he had at the ceremony, or maybe he just looked less armored. We sat down to eat. The table was set, simply nothing fancy, just the kind of meal that had sustained our family for decades. Conversation stayed on safe ground at first. Traffic, weather, my brother's plans. My mother spoke about a neighbor's new grandchild. My father listened more than he talked. Halfway through the meal, he set his fork down. "I've been thinking," he said. I waited. I kept telling myself that if something mattered, you would have said something, he continued. That silence meant there was nothing to say. I took a breath. Silence can mean many things, I replied. Sometimes it means trust. Sometimes it means boundaries. He nodded slowly. I didn't see that. I saw quiet and thought it meant failure. "That's because you were uncomfortable not knowing," I said, not unkindly. "So you filled the space." He looked down at his hands. I did. My mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his. He squeezed it, then looked back up at me. "I told people you dropped out," he said. I said it like it was fact. "Yes," I said. "I was wrong," he said again, more firmly this time, "and I'm sorry." The apology didn't come with excuses or justifications. It wasn't wrapped in pride. It was simple, and because of that, it landed. "I'm not angry," I told him, but it mattered. Words travel farther than we think. He swallowed. I see that now. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that no longer felt heavy. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for, not defensively, not with expectation, but with genuine curiosity. "What did you do?" he asked. "I don't need details, I just want to understand." I considered how to answer. Years ago, I might have tried to explain everything to justify myself. Now I chose carefully. "I served in ways that weren't meant to be seen," I said. "I helped make sure other people could do their jobs safely. I made decisions that didn't come with applause." He nodded slowly. "That sounds important." "It was," I said, "and it required silence." He leaned back in his chair, absorbing that. "I thought being proud meant talking," he said. "Turns out it might mean listening." "That's a good lesson," I said gently. "At any age." He gave a small, rueful smile. "I wish I'd learned it sooner." "So do I replied. And for the first time, saying it didn't hurt. After dinner, we moved into the living room. Old photo albums sat on the coffee table, their spines worn from years of being pulled down and put back. My father opened one at random, flipping through pictures of childhood birthdays, holidays, school events. There were gaps, years where I appeared only once or twice, always smiling politely, always leaving early. "I didn't ask then either," he said almost to himself. "No," I agreed. "But I could ask now," he said. "Yes," I replied. He looked up at me. "I'm proud of you," he said. "Not because of rank, because you stayed yourself." Something in my chest loosened at that. Recognition doesn't always come from being seen publicly. Sometimes it comes from being understood privately. When it was time to leave, my father walked me to the door. The evening air was cool, the porch light casting a familiar glow across the steps. "I won't tell that story anymore," he said, "about you quitting." "I know," I replied. "And if people ask," he pressed. "Tell them I served," I said. "That's enough." He nodded. "That's enough." As I drove away, I realized something important. Reconciliation isn't about rewriting the past. It's about agreeing to tell the truth, moving forward. And sometimes that's the most meaningful victory of all. Retirement didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, papers, signed responsibilities, handed over goodbyes, spoken quietly in hallways where no one lingered too long. The Navy doesn't celebrate endings the way civilians imagine. There are no curtain calls. You step aside and the work continues as it should. In the weeks after my final day, I found myself waking early out of habit. The house was quiet, sunlight just beginning to stretch across the kitchen floor. I brewed coffee and sat at the table listening to the small sounds of a life no longer ruled by schedules and alerts. For the first time in decades, there was space to reflect without checking a watch. That was when I understood what the ceremony and everything that followed had truly given me. It wasn't recognition, it wasn't vindication, it was clarity. My father adjusted slowly but sincerely. When neighbors asked about me now, he didn't reach for labels or shortcuts. He said my daughter served for many years. Sometimes he added, in ways we didn't always understand. He said it without embarrassment, without prideful boasting, just respect. That mattered more than any public moment ever could. One afternoon we sat together on his porch watching cars pass and leaves drift across the lawn. He stirred his coffee and said almost casually, "You know, I used to think the loudest people were the strongest." I waited. Now I think the strongest ones are the ones who don't need to be loud at all. I smiled, not because the statement was profound, but because it was learned. My brother visited not long after. He looked different out of uniform, lighter somehow. We talked about ordinary things, plans, work, the strange adjustment back to civilian rhythms. Before he left, he paused and said, "I've been telling some of the younger guys something." "What's that?" I asked. "That not all heroes stand at the front," he said. "Some stand behind the map." That too mattered. As time passed, I began speaking occasionally to small groups, retirees, veterans' families, young officers' spouses. Not to tell my story in detail, but to explain something simple, that service doesn't always announce itself, that some careers are built on silence because silence keeps people safe. That worth isn't measured by how often your name is spoken, but by how steady you are when no one is watching. People nodded. Some looked relieved, others thoughtful. Many, I realized, had lived their own quiet versions of being misunderstood. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's one I wish more families understood sooner. Don't speak for someone whose path you never asked about. Silence isn't failure. Often it's discipline. Often it's trust. Often it's a choice made in service of something larger than comfort or approval. And if you're the one who stayed quiet, who carried responsibility without recognition, I hope you hear this clearly. Your life doesn't need witnesses to be valid. Truth has a way of standing up on its own, even years later, even when you aren't asking it to. The day my father introduced me simply as his daughter, no rank, no correction, no story attached, I felt something settle into place. Not because the past had changed, but because it no longer needed defending. Some victories arrive without cheering, some reconciliations happen late, and some lessons take a lifetime to learn. But they are no less real for coming quietly. If this story gave you pause, if it reminded you of someone you misunderstood, or of a chapter of your own life that went unseen, I invite you to sit with that feeling for a moment. Maybe share this story with someone who might need it. And if you'd like to hear more stories grounded in dignity, truth, and the strength of quiet lives, consider staying with us and subscribing. Thank you for listening. Thank you for reflecting.